Alisha.
Thanks, Judy. Hi, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad you could be here with us today. I'm Alisha Babbstein. I'm the archivist here at OJMCHE, and I'm here today with our Curator of Collections, and LeVant Prahl, and the Director of the museum, Judy Margles. So we wanted to share with you today some of the fun and interesting clips that we have from our oral history collection. We gathered these clips and we think that these clips will give you a varied glimpse into the history and daily life of the early Jewish communities here in Oregon. And you'll have the great benefit of Anne and Judy to guide you through it. And they have a vast wealth of knowledge in this area. I wanted to let you know up front that some of the clips are a little hard to hear. We've done our best to clean them up, remove white noise, etc. But many of these recordings were done in the 70s. So bear with us for the few that are a little tougher to hear. We do have a slideshow prepared for you today with photographs, and the text for each clip will be in the slideshow, so you can follow along that way for the ones that are a little bit harder to hear. Because some of them are quieter, you might need to turn your volume up, and some of them the quality is excellent, so you might need to adjust your volume a little bit down. So just bear that in mind as we move through the presentation. And as Judy mentioned, just a reminder that we do have the chat and Q&A. So we ask that you use the chat for general comments and the Q&A for any specific questions. And so without further ado, I will hand it over to Anne.
Hello, I'm Anne LeVant Prahl. I'm the curator of our collection here at the museum. And I love to get to present our oral history collection because oral history offers us this firsthand narrative, or sometimes a secondhand narrative, when you're saying what your father saw, what your mother saw, and a glimpse of the past. And because our oral history project started so early, the very first one we have was that one that you saw as you were coming in. That was Shirley Tanzer interviewing Dora Levine, who owned the local fish market. And she interviewed Dora in 1969, and she started interviewing, the bulk of the interviews started just after that in the early 70s. So the people who were being interviewed have this collective memory back to way before the turn of the century. And if they're remembering stories they heard from their grandparents, it's far before that. So let's go ahead and play this first one, and then we'll talk a little bit about it.
It was on one of these trips into the Nez Perce country that grandfather met Chief Joseph. They became devoted friends. My grandfather, I am told, always thought of Chief Joseph as one of the most intelligent men he had ever known. He especially stressed the fact of Chief Joseph's love for peace. He felt very badly when Chief Joseph was sold down the river by the white man, because he always said that he was one of the finest gentlemen he had ever had the privilege of knowing.
I love how articulate she is. And that beautiful Western accent. That was Gladys Trachtenberg, and her grandfather that she's talking about was Julius Lowenberg, who was a really early arrival for the Jewish community. He arrived in San Francisco in 1851. And so his story on the West Coast is long. And he must have met Chief Joseph after he arrived in Oregon. He arrived in Oregon in 1871. So those are some of our earliest communal memories of the Jewish life in Oregon. Judy's going to go on and talk to us about some other arrivals and show you some more slides and listen to clips.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anne. I just really want to do a shout out. Thank you to both Alisha and Anne, who are dedicated so much of the time in their work to preserving our oral history project. And you're going to hear at the end, Alicia's going to tell you a little bit more about another oral history project that we're involved with. So huge gratitude on my part for both of you and for making this program possible today. So I do want to stick with this theme of arrivals, really looking at how Jews came into Oregon and how they spoke about it in the oral histories that we've gathered. And we have many, we have over 800 oral histories now in the collection, is that correct?
That's
so
correct.
Many of these oral histories do talk about that arrival moment. We're gonna play 4 clips about arrivals. We're gonna, Alisha, if you would play the first 2 clips, and then I'll talk in between, and then we'll listen to the last 2, and you'll see very distinctive experiences from everybody with some unifying themes. So play the first clip, please, Alisha.
Do you know where in Germany they came from?
Stuttgart, my father did. He left there, I think, when he was about 18 years old. He went via Panama Canal and then by ship to California. He had a sister that was married there in Berkeley. And from there he went up to Oregon, Astoria, Oregon, and he met my mother, who was a Hirsch in Salem, Oregon. And they got married and had this stationery store and a combination jewelry store for a few years. And then he moved up to Baker, Oregon, because my mother's sister was married to Mr. Sander in Baker, Oregon. There was a mining community and quite a busy place. That was in about 1885, I think. My sister Teresa was born there in Astoria. And I remember at a later time going to Astoria after my father moved to Baker, and we stayed at a hotel over plank walks on the Columbia River, and our old home was pointed up to me on the hills farther up in there.
What year would that have been when you returned
To
Astoria?
after I was 5 or 6 years old, I should judge. Oh, 1882 or 3. When we were back in Baker in 1887 when me and my mother moved there.
Excuse me, was there a particular reason why you left?
It was impossible for my father to make a living in Romania to support his family. The laws of the country at that time were such that no Jew would be able to become a citizen of Romania, and therefore every Jew was restricted from selling certain things. And my father was primarily a salesman, and the restrictions became greater and greater to the extent that my father could only maybe sell eggs in the early market in order to make a few cents with which to buy a little wood and buy a little food for the family. Well, my mother had a brother, Israel Korn, who had come to the United States earlier, and he was living in Portland, Oregon, and he promised my father a job. Now, it's hard for me to give an impression of the United States, having been only 7 years of age, but I can tell you the impressions that my father and mother had. Here they were in a free country, in a place where they could not fear to talk Yiddish. Here were they were in a place where they could go to their synagogue and walk down the street talking Yiddish if they want to, with their heads standing upright.
Thank you, Alisha. So 2 very, very different clips. And I have to say the LeVant Feldstein, every time I hear it, I get a little choked up to understand what this sense of freedom, what he understood as the 7-year-old, what the sense of freedom coming to the United States was for him. So we did first hear from Sanford Adler. His father had been born in Stuttgart, as he said, and he eventually made it to Astoria and then went to the mining community of Baker. LeVant Feldstein, as we just noted, was a young child. He was 7 years old. But it is this memory that we see replicated in these stories of our immigrants, the sheer amazement and appreciation for the freedoms that the United States held for them. So you have these 2 very distinctive experiences. You have the German Jewish experience, and these were Jews who arrived in the United States and in Oregon between the late 1840s and the 1880s. Then you have the Russian Jewish experience or the Eastern European experience. These were Jews who started arriving in Oregon in the late 1890s, well through the 1920s. And our community history makes it very clear, and I'll come back to this a little later with some other clips. The German Jews, they were really entrepreneurial. They came here, they were unafraid to make their homes and their livelihood in small towns across Oregon. And this is, of course, a story we see replicated in Canada and the United States, where there are small towns with one or two Jewish businesses. Those were generally the German Jews. While the Eastern European and the Russian Jews were much more interested in creating community in Portland, and they did so in South Portland. So let's keep listening. We're going to hear two more clips. The first is another Eastern European immigrant, and you'll hear that she reports a very different arrival experience. And then we're going to hear from someone who was able to leave Germany right after Kristallnacht.
For in the old country and Poland, we couldn't wait to get to America, because America was supposed to be the land of plenty for everyone, and we found exactly the opposite. I remember distinctly on that particular night, in the year of 1921, October 25th, we had huddled together in a dark, with a very small lighted room, and we all made up our minds that the next day we were going to go back to where we came from.
Now I'd like to go back to your very early impressions of living in the United States, how it was different from life in Europe. What struck you particularly about being different in the United States at first?
It's a different language. No, what struck me most, and probably struck most of any newcomer, was the absolute freedom you had over here. And you might say that the feeling that when the bell rings in the morning at 6 o'clock, it's the newspaper boy or some kind of a delivery and not the police, is worth alone the price of admission to the United States. And that is probably one of the things that foreigners most appreciate in the United States. This sense of freedom and this sense of not being guilty before being judged, which we did not have in Europe.
I'm so grateful. I think we should be grateful for the oral histories in our collection, such as Flora Rubinstein's, that are not simply, oh, life is grand, it's so wonderful to be here. These are the real stories. And you know, Flora arrived in Portland. She was a young child. She was with her mother. She had 3 siblings, and she was reuniting with her father. Nobody in the family had seen him for 8 years. And, you know, so her family was completely bewildered by American cultural behavior, and they were racked by doubt. So even though they were able to sort of pass through the golden door, once they made that decision to stay and they passed through the golden door, they persisted in passing through it and making this decision to stay. And, you know, that was their pursuit of the American dream, of course. John Miller's experience, very different. He'd been born in Stuttgart in Germany in 1907. 1936, he was married and he was arrested for insulting Hitler. He really tried to get out of Germany after he was released from prison, but he wasn't able. He was very fortunate that he was able to get out after Kristallnacht. So you can see here, despite the cultural differences of the 4 clips, the 4 people that we listened to, and really it's for better or worse, if you think about Flora Rubenstein's comments, I think everybody that we listened to, and so many of these arrival stories, they really understood this seismic shift in the way that they could find a better life in the United States. And this is a theme. We see so many themes in our oral histories that bring out sort of the thinking of these people, you know, themes such as dislocation, which Flora mentioned. We're going to get into themes about education, community, language, family ties, religion, citizenship. All these things surface in our oral histories. I'm going to turn it back to Anne, who's going to pick up the thread of South Portland.
Yeah, I wanted to just add that these early arrival stories really make you feel how bad things had to have been in the old country to make, because it was such a difficult journey. And Flora Rubinstein's family had such a hard trip to America and getting through Ellis Island and getting to Portland. And John's comment is so poignant that the thing that he remembers is that it's not a bad thing when the doorbell rings, that you don't have to be afraid. And think just how bad things had to have been to make that decision to get out. So off we go to the newsboys. I love our newsboys pictures. I don't think we have a picture of Boris Geller who's talking. I think this picture is Morris Geller, isn't it? I think he's a Geller, but he's not the one who's talking. And other pictures of the newsboys, who were just as you can imagine, they were a tough and scrappy group of guys. Well, let's go ahead and hear Boris talk first.
We don't have his clip, so I'll go ahead and read it.
We'll hear Alisha imitating Boris Geller.
We were all immigrants at the turn of the century. My father worked for $5 a week. There were 300 to 400 newsboys on the streets of Portland. For every quarter that came in, the boys could buy food for their parents. There were 7 in our family and someone had to help. Meat was 10 cents a pound in those days. If you had 50 cents, you could feed a family of 6.
Every single boy who was a newsboy tells about his life, and they were all the same. These boys woke up in the morning and sold newspapers. They went to school, either to the failing school or to the Shattuck School in South Portland. They went straight from school to the neighborhood house to study Hebrew. And then when they got out of Hebrew school, they went right back out onto their corners and sold newspapers and brought home whatever money they could earn to their mothers who ran the households. It was not an easy life. And they grew up to be mensches, they grew up to be community-minded boys. And while they were still teenagers, they founded an organization for themselves called the Newsboys, the Portland Newsboys. And that grew as they became adults into the South Parkway Club, which was one of the clubs that met at the neighborhood house, the gathering place for South Portland. And they collected money and supported the Old Men's Jewish Home and other communal organizations and became the mainstays of the neighborhood when they were grown-ups. Now back to Judy, who has one of our favorite interviews. Like Boris Geller, this interview reaches back to an early era in South Portland and really makes you feel like you were there. Listen to her.
And I just want to, just one newsboy comment, they also competed with each other, right? They had the turf wars, who was on what corner, and then who was making the most money to bring home for the family.
And you had to buy your corner from the boy who had it before you. You had to pay to be on that corner. It was a whole syndicate.
Which helped them learn about business, which was also good. As Anne said, we're going to listen to a quote from Bessie Harris. It is one of our favorites, as you'll hear. Listen really closely to the very end, right to the end, where her punchline is great. And again, we have to remember that when Bessie was telling this story, she's an elderly woman sort of reminiscing about this experience. But at the same time, if we listen closely to her words, we can kind of hear how harrowing it might have been for a child her age. So let's play the clip.
On Friday mornings, my mother said, "It's time to go to LeVant's fish market to pick up the fish for the weekend." And if we were fortunate enough, or rather unfortunate enough, to have to carry the chicken down to Mr. LeVant to get it killed, well, that was another thing. I was really very frightened about carrying live chickens. So Mama very kindly would put it into a gunny sack for me, and I'd have to hold it out at least 12 inches from my body for fear that he might peck on me if it were any closer. Well, coming back was a much easier process because the chicken was dead already.
It's like that experience was so indelibly planted in Bessie Harris to the point that she knew 12 inches was where she had to hold that chicken. Honestly, I don't have a lot more to say about this clip. Mrs. LeVant ran this fish shop for years, and her husband, who was the shochet, lived across the street. So Bessie would take the chicken across the street for her husband to ritually slaughter. I'm going to turn it back to Anne. We're just continuing the theme of South Portland.
Yeah, this first clip here just speaks to me of the warmth and the family relationships in South Portland, how having your whole family live within walking distance of your house, and how important these Shabbos dinners were for the whole family to gather. There on the right is the Blackman-Rotenberg family. It's Harry Arnsberg who's going to be speaking, but I didn't have a picture of his family. I imagine they were all very similar. Families gathered around a table that was much too small for them because they were big families, big extended families. And it just, especially in this time of being all isolated, it makes me nostalgic for those family gatherings that we can't do right now. And well, here, let's listen to Harry.
Of course, in the old days, visiting neighbors was a very common thing. People still had the graciousness that they had from the old country, and Friday night was always a gathering of the family. The Friday night meal was a big event each week. And even though we didn't have much money, I think we had something that we don't have today, a closeness of family that our affluent society has taken away.
Yeah, I don't think we can overstate the close-knit nature of South Portland. So many people talk about being raised by the whole neighborhood. Oh, who is it, Judy? Dan Labbe, he talks about his mother getting calls from all the women in the neighborhood that he had just ridden his trike past their house, and everyone keeping track of everyone else's kids, and all the doors always open to them. And it made me remember that from this next quote, Mary Rosenberg is talking about the warmth of the neighborhood, not just Jews to Jews or Italians to Italians, but it was really an immigrant neighborhood where people took care of each other. The little Italian kids that were interviewed as part of this oral history project talked about their first job being to light a fire in a Jewish home on Saturday morning, because the Jews wouldn't light their own fires on Saturday morning, so the Italian kids were in there. Here's Mary Rosenberg talking about an Italian home.
I know when my brother that has just passed away, I remember he got scarlet fever and he was just so little. And my other little brother was just a baby, about a year old. And in those days, they slapped a big quarantine, a great big red sign on your house, and you were in for 6 weeks. You couldn't go out of the house or anything. And so I stayed to watch my little brother so he wouldn't get near my other brother. And a Gentile neighbor was a lovely person, took my sister, because she was older and she was in a higher grade, and it would have, she would have more to lose than I would. And she stayed there the whole 6 weeks. One of the things I always remember, because my mother worried what would my sister eat, and she told her, the woman, and she said, "Don't worry, I'll never give her meat. You don't have to worry." And she would give her things that did not have meat, and she understood and respected it.
I just love that. Love that not only would they take her in, but they would also respect her need to keep kosher and feed her food that she was allowed to eat. All right, Judy is going to take over and talk about one of the ways that the residents of South Portland entertain themselves.
Yep, and let's just play the quote, and then we can talk a little bit about it afterwards.
Well, those were quite a cheerful day for us. Mother, of course, was in the box office selling the tickets. My brother was up in the booth, was the projectionist, and Dad, of course, was the overseer. And without any air conditioning in those days, during the summertime, we'd have to open up the side exit doors so get circulation of air. And then came the advent of a popcorn machine, which my dad thought of, and that, of course, became my first legal job, was to pop the popcorn and sell the popcorn, and then, of course, was candy and peanuts and the gum. And actually, it was the forerunner of the first theater in the United States that was selling the concession of the popcorn, and which has become quite a big business now in theaters.
Now, the neighborhood was largely an immigrant neighborhood. Did the residents of the neighborhood understand the movies?
No, that was always used to tickle me. There used to seem to be a certain group that would get together, and they would have somebody who was able to read the English titles, and then she would turn around and translate them into Yiddish to this particular group, and this would happen in several areas in the theater. Or the children, perhaps, of the parents would do the translating for the parents.
It's such a great image, right? You can just picture in the movie theater this sort of buzz of the children translating for their parents. So it used to be with us, and it will be sometime soon, going to the movies was a great pastime. It was a chance for everybody to escape sort of the toils of their daily life, and it was huge entertainment from the first time that the silent films came up. And Portland, I'm sure some of you know way more than I do, Portland had a huge number of movie theaters in the early days. The photo you're looking at is the Lincoln Theater, if I remember, was at 3rd and College. Ann, is that correct? 3rd and College?
That sounds right to me.
Someone knows, put it in the chat if they remember exactly where the movie theater was. I'm going to pass it back to Ann, who's going to talk about picnicking. We're still sort of staying on this theme of the community in South Portland.
And also on how they entertain themselves, especially during those Depression years when times were lean. We have so many stories about people picnicking. And I love the stories about Lake Oswego being a rustic rural destination where you could go off into the woods of Lake Oswego for a picnic. And Tualatin and Beaverton were wilderness spaces. And well, let's hear, there are 3 clips here: Rose Olds and Francis Sliffman and David Finkelstein.
But we used to have fun. When my father could afford it, he bought a truck on Sunday. Mom would ask another family, like Mrs. Newman or even Mrs. Geller, who had no car. And they would cook, and put all their cooked dinner on the truck, and Pa would drive to the Oaks Park. Now, when we went to the Oaks Park, they had to cook because they wouldn't eat anything but their own kosher food. But Oaks Park didn't cost us a nickel, whereas now if you go, I understand, it costs,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Plenty. But we never paid anything. And it was joyous. The ladies used to sit on benches in the truck and talk to each other away from the stove. And then when we sat down to eat, it was all together. It was beautiful. And we young stuff knew we couldn't go buy any popcorn, we couldn't go buy any peanuts or a hot dog, nothing like that. What we ate is what was on the truck.
And I had a lot of cousins that lived around in the neighborhood too. And my dad had a little truck. And I don't know if this would be that interesting to you or not, but I think you'd like to hear about it. And we used to go to the different parks, like the Oaks and to Selwood Park. And we'd get into the truck and we'd sit in the back and we'd sing songs and we'd just have a ball. And people would love to go to the Oaks Park because there were all these tables and picnics were going on from the different organizations too. And everybody would get together and just have a wonderful time.
Then in the summertime we used to go out, the Council Crest at a big hall, a big dance hall. And we used to go on the Council Crest on the streetcar, you know, to go out there on Saturday night. Used to be big dances, hundreds of them. And in the summertime, we used to go out, there were picnics. Different organizations gave picnics, and they would organize it, and they would start from First and Alder Street, and just about when they were supposed to leave at, let's say, 9 o'clock in the morning, and the streetcars would start out, and there was some Jewish woman, you know, with the children running with a basket of food, and she making noises and waving, you know, for the streetcars to stop and pick him up. And we'd go out for the day. We'd go out Crystal Lake Park, Oaks Park, different places. Some of them, one of them was near Oregon City. Used to go quite a way, you know. And we'd go out there. There was a band. There was dancing in the, you know, in the afternoon, and mostly eating. The elderly people were sitting playing cards, you know, and the younger people were dancing. And we used to go out sometimes. We used to go to Crystal Lake Park, was dancing in the afternoon. And at night, and we didn't have the money to pay for it. It was cost 50 cents to pay. So we would go in, and one fellow would go in, and another one would pull the rest of us in, go into the men's room and open the window and pull some of the boys in.
That's
you know,
a trick.
because we didn't have any money to pay for it. You know, money was scarce.
Just wonderful. Love his accent. And also, I think the finding things to do that didn't cost any money was so critical. Even the money for that streetcar was a lot, and the idea that they all had to bring their own food because they all kept kosher. Well, most of them kept kosher, and so these are people who never went to a restaurant either because they couldn't afford it or because they kept kosher. So their entertainment, getting to eat outside of their home, meant going on a picnic. Having eaten outside so often this summer, it all rings true. All right, back to Judy for a little comic relief.
Yeah, and maybe by way of introducing the next clip and just following up on what Anne was saying, you know, you have David Finkelstein right there talking about money being scarce. And of course, these oral histories are given, the ones we're listening to today are mostly given by elderly Oregonians who are reflecting back on their experiences. So you see from his experience, it was just idyllic. These stories of picnics, they present a very idyllic picture of the community. And by and large, my sense of what we've read about it is that it was, but there were difficulties too. Money was scarce, and we're going to see that. We're going to get into the Depression shortly. We are just going to play a clip. As Anne said, it is comic relief. It is about Fanie Porter. If you know who Fanie Porter is, put it in the chat, or if you have any experiences with Fanie Porter from hearing about it from any of your relatives. So she was the head of Failing School. Alicia, can you show the photo of her, or does the clip play? Yeah, so there's Fanie right in the middle there. She was a very fearsome woman by the many accounts in our collection. Alicia's going to read this. This is a quote from Jerry Stern. Unfortunately, the audio wasn't good enough to play it. So Alicia is going to enact Jerry Stern, who is relating this really hilarious story.
The principal at Failing School was a very large woman named Miss Porter. Miss Porter was a tough gal, and everybody was afraid of her. This one particular student's name was Jakey Weinstein. There were 3 or 4 Jakey Weinsteins in Portland, Oregon. One day in his class, he said some dirty words. His teacher sent him to Miss Porter, and Miss Porter washed his mouth out with soap. When he went home that night, he told his little Jewish mother what had happened. And the next day, this little Jewish woman went storming into Failing School and storming into Miss Porter's room. She walked up to Miss Porter and stuck her finger in Miss Porter's face and said, "Miss Porter, if my Jakey is a bad boy, you have my permission. You can give him a flosk, you can yell at him, you can potch him, but don't you dare ever wash his mouth out with soap again. Soap is trafe, and he cannot have trafe in his mouth."
I can hear everybody laughing, right?
I can just see this little old woman.
It is quite something. I think we're just going to go right into, I've lost my place somehow. This is not good. Hang on.
Dora Ale, Judy, Dora Ale.
Okay, let's just go right in and play Dora Ale's quote, and then we'll talk about that. Thank you.
What are your memories of your happiest times here?
Happiest times? Happiest times was later on, honey. When my children got married, and my husband and I, we didn't have to worry so much about their schooling. I had to save every little bit to send my son to college, and we didn't have it. And my husband would say to me, "Why do you do that? You just tear out of yourself and you're sending," he says, "I'm willing for him to get an education, but not like the way you're doing." And I says, "You're going to get an interest someday." The interest was when he became lawyer, and I always used to remind him that. But he did some work too. He waited on tables. He threw some sawdust in for some people. He worked in a shoe store. He did some, but it was not enough. So I helped him. And when the children got married later on in life, we didn't meet as much, and things gotten a little bit better. And still, we used to go in our car. We didn't want to, I didn't want to go in a plane because I felt it would cost too much money, and that extra money the children could still use it, and that's what we did.
And you know, I think there is a common theme between the mothers, Dora talking about her son, or Jakey Weinstein's mother running into the school to protest at the idea that her son was being given something that wasn't kosher. And education, of course, was so important for these immigrants, right? You've got, we just listened to Dora Ale. She'd been born in Poland in 1901 and came as a young child with her family, a very circuitous route for them to be able to leave Poland. They went through Siberia, they went through Manchester, they landed first in Rhode Island, and then they moved to Portland in 1921. And I actually think, at least my age, Dora Ale is kind of like all of our grandmothers, right? She's taking great pleasure, such great pleasure in the accomplishments of her children, her grandchildren. She cherishes the closeness of her family. And then very much she also cherishes the freedom that life in America has offered to her. And of course, this sort of parsimoniousness that comes out in the way that she doesn't want to give herself any pleasure. She really only wants to benefit the welfare of her family.
I love that she says it's an investment. She's investing in her son, and it pays off when he becomes a lawyer.
Exactly. So we're just going to stick to this theme of education, and we're going to hear a clip from Gus Solomon. This might be a name known to all of you. Gus was born to immigrant parents in 1906. He was a graduate of Reed College and actually finished his law degree at Columbia, moved back to Portland after that to practice. And Gus Solomon was the he was the longest serving federal judge in Oregon's history. So, and there's a lovely little joke at the beginning of his clip, so listen closely.
You know that old statement, why does a young man become a lawyer? It's a Jewish boy that can't stand the sight of blood.
Yeah.
And there was nothing for me to do, actually. So in 1926, it was easier for Jews to get into law school then, particularly if you were from the West Coast and went to the East Coast. They didn't have these geographic quotas as bad as it subsequently developed. And so I applied to Harvard and I got in, but I didn't go to Harvard. Phil Silver went to Harvard, and Ted Sweat went to Harvard, some of my friends. But I went to Columbia University because I wanted to go to New York.
Yeah.
I had been to New York once in my life when I was 11 years old. My father took me to New York to see my brother off, who was going to France. But I always remembered that city, and that's where I wanted to go. And so I went to New York, and there were other people who went to New York, and I had a roommate by the name of Max Gordon. He went there too. He wanted to go to law school.
Yeah.
Max Gordon, of course, if you don't recognize the name, he was another Jewish Portlander, and he went on to found the great folk and jazz venue, the Village Vanguard in New York. So Gus Solomon, his interview is so real to who he was as a person. Throughout his interview, he describes himself as this a political and economic liberal. He operated under this very simple belief that everyone is entitled to certain rights, regardless of race, religion, economic status. So it makes sense that he mentions the quotas in his oral history, because he fought against discrimination and anti-Semitism in his personal life as well as his legal career. There are other places in his oral history that he talks about how he refused to attend events at private clubs, such as the University Club or the Arlington Club. Any club that wouldn't allow Jewish members, he refused to go. There's another quote in his oral history where he says, "I just say that unless Jews are accepted on terms of equality for all purposes, I wouldn't go." So Anne's just going to talk a little bit about another, we don't have a clip, but there's another story we have in our archives about George Bodner. And Anne, do you want to just tell us about that?
I was thinking how George overlaps both Dora Ailes and Gus Solomon's interview, because the idea of education being so important to the mothers. When George Bodner was, I think he was just a freshman or sophomore in college when his father died, and his father had a tailoring business in Northwest Portland, and he said he was coming home, that he was going to leave school and he would come home and run the business, and his mother said, absolutely not. You have to go on with your education and stay in school. So that's the mother part of his story. And the other part of his story is that he was a victim of the quotas. It was very difficult for Jews to get into medical school at the time. And George wanted to go to medical school, and the advice that he got was to go to dental school instead. It was easier to get into dental school, and the first 2 years at the Oregon Medical School were the same for medical and dental school. I believe they still are. And then he could transfer and become a doctor after that. That could be his way in. As it happened, it turned out he loved being a dentist, so he never did switch over. But there are several stories about people becoming dentists because they were quoted out of the medical school. And that's Depression times. We're gonna keep talking about the Depression. And I think we don't have the Nathan Schwartz clip, right? Alisha is going to read us a depression, one of the Depression quotes from Nathan Schwartz.
We had a lot of rough times, especially as you all know, how you could buy 3 donuts and a cup of coffee for a nickel, but you didn't have a nickel.
Gotta love it. Over and over again, though, you hate to play up the idealism of what it was like to grow up in this shtetl inside of the city, but over and over again, the people say, yeah, we were poor, but everybody was poor, so you didn't really have anyone else to compare yourself to, and you didn't really know you were poor. They didn't really know they were poor until they grew up and became successful, and they looked back on their lives. How about Manel Labbe?
He did what most immigrants do. He still didn't have a very good, only a very sparse conversant way of communicating to the people that he was in contact with in daily life. Although Jews will gravitate to where Jews are, nevertheless, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way they're going to make their living. They have to branch out. And he did what a lot of other Jews do when they first come here. He got himself a horse and he got himself a wagon, and he went out and he had native intelligence enough to know that if you bought something for 10 cents, you sold it for 15 cents, he made 5 cents.
Gosh, I love it. I guess I wasn't paying enough attention when we put this together, because that's not about the Depression at all. That's way earlier.
No, but I think it does speak, whether we're talking about the Depression or the early years that these immigrants came, particularly the Russian and Eastern European Jews, you know, when they came into Portland, life was extremely difficult, right? But nonetheless, and I think we're getting this, I hope you're getting this from the clips we're reading, that there was always this sense of neighbor helping neighbor, strangers helping strangers, right? There's another, we're gonna hear a little bit from Millard Rosenblatt later on. He was a surgeon, but he in particular remembers during the Depression how hard as a surgeon it was to make money. And he tells another story how he resected the stomach of a farmer who had cancer, and he received 20 pounds of potatoes as his fee. So he talked about how he distributed the potatoes to everyone he knew, all his friends and people in need. He kept some for himself, but that's all he would get. So I'm looking at the time, and I know that we have a few more clips to get through. So if everybody is okay, if we run the program till 1:15, I know that some people will have to get off at 1 o'clock, and we'll probably keep going till about 1:15, and we will make sure we have time for questions too. We're going to listen now to a clip from Laddie, another clip from Laddie Trachtenberg. There's just too much good material in there. This is a clip that is particularly difficult to listen to, but the transcript is up there too.
I can still remember Jonah Weiss tried an experiment of having services on Sunday mornings in hopes he could get the fellows in too, as well as the old ladies. And I remember one Sunday, all of us came up from religious school to attend the services. We called it Sunday school then. And I don't remember how it happened, but his robe came apart. I mean, the hook must have come unhooked or something. And here he was in his golf knickers. And of course everybody burst out laughing. And some of the men, including my father, were in theirs also.
Can you just picture it? They're in at Beth Israel, and this happens with Rabbi Jonah Weiss. It is a hilarious story, but I do think it has a more serious aspect to it, and which echoes Gus Solomon's observations about clubs that didn't allow Jews in. So Rabbi Jonah Weiss came to Portland in 1900. He was an avid golfer. He'd come from, he came in 1906, and he came from Cincinnati. And what did he find when he comes here? That none of the golf courses, none of the country clubs were going to allow him to play because he was Jewish. So undeterred by that, he joined with others in the Jewish community, and he purchased to purchase the land and create the Tualatin Country Club. And we see this time and time in our oral histories, if Jews were not allowed to do something because they were Jewish, they just replicated their needs, right? This is why we had the first Jewish community center. They were very good at doing that. I think, Alisha, in the interest of time, let's just skip over Miriam Rosenfeld's quote. We can put it in the chat maybe so people can see it. It was just another quote about Jonah Weiss, but I'll give it back to Anne to talk about Harry Rubenstein.
Okay, I've lost my place, but
I will put Miriam Rosen.
Well, I had a place, but who knows what it was. Harry Rubenstein was one of the Jews who was not in Portland. I think he started out up here, and he went down to Medford, Oregon, and ran a secondhand store in Medford, Oregon. This just speaks to the small towns all over the Willamette Valley and in Eastern Oregon and at the coast, where there would be just a handful of Jewish families in town, sometimes just one Jewish family in town, and how well they got on with the town. Some towns had Jewish mayors, and in our newspaper collection, we have notices, very early on, notices that this or that store would be closed in honor of the Jewish holiday, and it was just well known to the non-Jews that there were these Jewish holidays and the stores would be closed. This quote particularly makes me happy because Harry was so admired by his community.
This quote's a little bit hard to hear too, but we'll go ahead and.
What happened, for instance, on a Jewish holiday? Did you close?
Oh yes, the holiday of Easter closed on Rosh Hashanah. Includes 1 day, 2 days Rosh Hashanah, 1 day Yom Kippur. So one day I was Yom Kippur, I was there and I closed it up, but I didn't go to Portland because my partner went. So, but I had a sign, be open at the sunset. You know, that time the sun goes down about 6:30, 7 o'clock. So I was 7 o'clock, I was there. And I come down to the store, there was a line, maybe 15 or 20 people waiting to get in there. So there was, the one guy says to me, he says, did you advertise a sale? He happens to be a Jewish salesman. I says, no, I said, today is Yom Kippur. He didn't know it was Yom Kippur. He says, no, I had a sign up, it's not like on the Jewish holiday. So one customer come over and talk to me. He was from, they call it Applegate in the country there. And he spent with me about $300, bought furniture, bought a stove, I know. Says, and then he says to me, do you know, we coming to Metro 10 o'clock this morning. And I says to my wife, we're going to wait till they open up, because if they don't respect their religion and close the businesses, give up the business for a day just to respect their holiday, they're going to wait. He told me that story himself.
Isn't that lovely?
Should I take over and keep going, Anne?
Yeah, why don't we? Well, are we going to do, yeah, yes, we're going to do kosher.
We are going to do kosher. Actually, we're just going to turn and think a little bit about a subject that you might not normally think about when you think about the Jewish community, and that is clam digging, right? And these are wonderful, wonderful, wonderful anecdotes that appear in our oral histories that show just this tension that assimilation brought to Jews, right? Not everybody kept kosher upon arrival. Not many came from a background where they were keeping kosher necessarily, but those that did, many tried to maintain it, and many tried to sort of figure out ways to both be American, but also adhere to the halakha of Judaism. So these are stories that we're going to listen to about clam digging at the Oregon coast. It was definitely a favorite activity. We have, as I said, these stories in our oral histories. So everybody from littlest children to the oldest generations, they would do it together. And as I tried to say a few minutes ago, clamming was kind of perhaps a way that this first wave of Jewish immigrants could really show their fact that they were American. Clams, of course, are not kosher. So if one chose to eat the clams, but maintained a kosher home. They would bring their bounty to the house where they could eat the clams. So we're just going to listen to 2 stories.
Just one story.
One story.
And my grandfather, of course, who was raised in Europe, where everyone was kosher, but they weren't too strict. They wouldn't not have unkosher food in the house. But he really loved hard-shelled clams on a half shell. However, he was embarrassed by the thought of God watching him eat that. So we would open a clam and hand it to him, and he was turned his back toward God and swallow it.
Alisha, were you going to read the other quote, or we were going to skip that?
Just skip in time for time.
That's fine. There is another comment elsewhere in the collection that only Linda's mother would clean and cook. Of the other mothers wanted them in their house, so they really did have to sort of figure out an accommodation. And we also have stories where they would dig for the clams, but absolutely they wouldn't eat them. So the stories run the whole gambit of our Jewish community. And do you want to do a couple of more examples about the beach?
Yes. I had wanted to talk a lot about the tradition of going to the beach, but let's play the clips first, and then we'll talk a little bit about the beach.
You went to the coast in horses?
Oh yes, it took 2 days. Yeah, everything was loaded in the wagon and went through the woods. Everything was forest in those days too. But oh, it was a grand thing. Oh, the roads were everywhere were just trails, you might say. We used to call them, a lot of these roads, wagon trails, because it still had stumps right in the middle of the road. Some of them had trees right in the middle. You'd have to go around one side or the other side, and you go around one side until the mud hole got too deep on that side, and then you started going around the other side.
Gearhart was, in the early days, a social center of the West. There were quite a few Jewish people, both from Seattle and Portland. But you could get there by train, and the men from Portland could come down Friday night or Saturday and go home Sunday night and see their families who stayed there all summer.
Yeah.
It didn't take too long, 4 hours or so on the train. I remember the first time I ever went to Gearhart in an automobile, it took 7.5 hours.
How much would you have to want to get to the beach that you would be willing to take that wagon over the rutted roads to get there for 2 days? Yeah, the advent of the train was a great thing. That picture up at the top was given to us, and it's titled on the back, "Waiting for the Daddy Train." The children and the mothers were at the beach all summer long, and they would come on Friday afternoons or Friday evenings and wait for their men to come who had been working in the city all week, and come on the daddy train and spend the weekend with their families at the beach.
I'm going to recommend that we just move to Manel Labbe, and Anne, if you would just take that one, just in the interest of time, because I think we want to make sure.
Already 1 o'clock. Oh my goodness. There are so many more you all need to hear. All right. Manel Labbe is my personal favorite. Manel was one of those newsboys that you saw the picture of early, and because of his experience as a newsboy, he became a labor organizer. He was part of the newsboys when they were organized to strike against the newspaper distributors who they worked for, and they were successful in that. And he had a lifelong mission to give a voice to the working people. Let's hear him talking about that.
Insofar as being a union man is concerned, I am one. I always have been one.
I am heart and soul in favor of unionization, for the simple reason that I saw what we could do in our industry. When I saw what could be done with people who were completely helpless individually, and how they were able to better their circumstances economically, not only economically, but intellectually, culturally, socially, physically, in every conceivable way. I saw what could be done to people who were so helpless, mostly women in the trade, who couldn't even speak English. How could you do anything else but be dedicated to that kind of a principle?
Yeah. Just to sum up and to come right back to what it is to have an oral history collection and this idea of first person narrative, because you get history, but you get history from a very unique and individual perspective. We have Manel Labbe talking about all the great that was done with the unions, and we also have in the collection Jaime Kirshner, who was one of the garment excuse me, garment business owners that Manel fought with to get him to unionize, and who fought unionization tooth and nail. He moved his business to Vancouver so that he didn't have to unionize. And so we get them actually talking about each other, because they were personalities that the two of them knew, and just a unique feature of history through oral history. I think we are ready to take questions. If you have questions, I see that there are a couple in the Q&A. Please go ahead and put more in there. I wish that we could hear your voices, but at least you can hear ours.
Well, absolutely wonderful question that someone is asking about, was there organized crime? Was that part of the immigrant experience? And I would say absolutely. And you might want to speak to this more coherently than I can, but there were
I have a deep love of the underbelly of Portland. There was organized crime. There was organized crime. I have been told that that vending machines were the way to see if about organized crime. That was one of the clues that somebody was involved, was that they were in the vending machine business. Also boxing. There were the boxing business was part of the racket. We have I believe a self-published book by Leonard Kaufman. Yes, Alisha, about Portland's underbelly. Leonard Kaufman's father, who was also named Leonard Kaufman, had a diner. He had a card shop where people would come and play cards. It was a place where men would come at lunch and after work. And it was definitely a place where that element met and visited. And he loved to come in and tell us stories about that. Right. And then the next question was about the German Jews and the Russian Jews. And I think that is an experience that is similar all over the United States. There was definitely tension between the German Jews and the Eastern European Jews in Portland, but I think so much less so because the Jewish community here was so small. There was much more interaction than there would have been in a larger city where people could factionalize more. But we definitely have references to it in the oral histories. Jews who grew up in South Portland tended to be Eastern European, and their German counterparts who had been here for a full generation or sometimes 2 generations before them were more assimilated and not living in the isolated Jewish area, but were living, side by side with their non-Jewish neighbors. The Beth Israel Synagogue was a German-founded synagogue, and the Eastern European Jews were less comfortable there.
And I just want to mention when the German Jews were already highly assimilated and integrated in the community when the Russian Jews began arriving. And again, a story that is replicated across the United States and Canada, that the German Jews had to welcome their brethren, so to speak, but they didn't really want them participating side by side. They didn't want them living where they were living. They didn't want them necessarily going to their Reformed synagogue. Conversely, the Russian and Eastern European Jews, by and large, wanted to stay self-reliant, well, to kind of keep their traditions in check. So you had that too. And I would also say that the sort of the tensions between the German Jews and the Russians, Eastern Europeans, and Sephardics, that was fairly early. I always use the date 1938. It's a little bit of a fictitious date, but that's the date that the B'nai B'rith Center, which had been founded in 1914 as the community center mostly for the German Jews originally. The Russian Jews would participate in activities at the neighborhood house, but the Jewish Community Center, which had been built at Southwest Main and 14th, when it changed its name from the B'nai B'rith Center to the Jewish Community Center in 1938, as I said, it's not a real date that things all of a sudden changed, but I think it's safe to say that by 1938, there was a little more integration. That being said, we definitely have stories in our oral histories about intermarriage not being between Jews and non-Jews, but being between Jews who have a Eastern European background and a German background. So if there are no other questions, and we're getting a lot in the chat that we need to do this again, I think we would love to. I think this was probably 1/1000th of the great and beautiful oral histories in our collection. So we're going to return to Alisha.
Wait, I just want to answer Curtis McBride's question there. He said that he asks about alcohol sales, and it's just a funny story because it's also Leonard Kaufman, who Leonard's grandfather came up from California to start a wholesale alcohol business, and it was definitely mob connected. And when his son became old enough, that's the Leonard Kaufman, the elder, became old enough to start thinking about going into business, the alcohol selling father sold his business because he didn't want his son involved in something so shady. And then his son bought a gambling house. So that was how that family rolled.
Love it.
Yeah, I'll just, I was just gonna go ahead and close up with some remarks here. Of course, thank you all for being here. I did want to mention, I saw in the chat someone asked, and I think Judy answered, if we had any interviews from 1917 to 1920, roughly when the pandemic 100 years ago was going on. And just a little plug for our other project that we're doing. We're actually collecting stories from the Oregon Jewish community right now about our experiences individually and collectively this year during this pandemic. And a big reason we're doing that is because we don't have any stories from that early pandemic. And there are a lot of reasons why we don't have stories from that time. Record keeping, of course, was very different. The people who kept records were primarily medical professionals when it came to that sort of, to the pandemic specifically. And a lot of people didn't want to talk about it. It was a really, really bad time. It was awful. And not that everyone is excited to talk about the pandemic now. And I know we've been talking about it now for months and months, but it's important that we collect these stories. And as you can see from this presentation, none of these stories have to do with this pandemic, but they give us this insight into the Jewish community and this experience in Oregon that we wouldn't have otherwise. It's not the same to see it in a photograph without any context, or to read it in a book when it's been wordsmithed in any number of ways. I think these oral histories are really valuable. And so this other project that we're conducting we're using a platform called Their Story. And like I said, we're collecting stories from the Oregon Jewish community about our experiences. So if anyone's interested, it'd be fantastic if you wanted to sign up. You can send me an email letting me know that you would like to be interviewed, or if you know people you think we should interview. I think Anne was going to mention something about transcribers too. Anne, do you want to?
Yes, I'm just quickly putting your.
Oh, I'm doing it.
That's Alicia's email, so that you can email her. Yeah. Also, we have a backlog of oral history interviews that need to be transcribed, and we have the training to get you up there and working at it. If you have access to a computer and you like to type, use that same email address. Let Alisha know, and I will get you trained and working as a transcriber. It would be wonderful to get some of our more current oral histories transcribed as well.
Yeah.
All right, I think we are done.
Yeah, Judy?
I think we just want to thank you. I really do want everyone in your own homes really to give Alisha and Anne just a cheer. We wouldn't be able to do any of this without their careful preservation of our preservation and expansion of our oral history collection. And we just felt it totally appropriate. We're going to end with one last clip. Won't tell you who it is. It is a Portland icon. Unfortunately, we never got an oral history, but we have lots and lots of his voices. So when this clip ends, we're going to end the program. Thank you, thank you, thank you for joining us today.
And that's all, folks.
Bye-bye. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.